Welcome to the Homeschool Together podcast. Where one working mom and a stay-at-home dad help you navigate the nuts and bolts of the growing and dynamic world of homeschooling.
With a focus on early learners, like me.
All the ins and outs of building and maintaining your homeschool life.
Homeschool.
Find out tips and tricks to make things like this easier.
I'm reading.
And ultimately, enjoy educating your kids. And what's that last thing?
Have fun together. Did I do good, Daddy?
Yeah, you did, sweetie. Good job. Hello and welcome back to Homeschool Together. Thank you for joining us. We are currently without children. We have shipped them off to camps and grandparents and
then this is what we're doing with our time.
Do you hear the joy in our voice?
Yeah, we're spending our time with all of you.
No, Mr. Matt is very productive, I have to say.
We have both been very productive. We've been
Absolutely.
getting all of our to-do list items done so that we can take off and enjoy a little time in Hawaii in another month or two here.
Out of here. It's our 15-year anniversary, 1 year late.
Yeah. After my car accident last year, we couldn't go, and so we're celebrating it a year late. But so in order to do that, we're getting ahead of things, and we are working on podcasts and recording. We're going to be coming out with YouTube videos, so stay tuned for those. We are very hard at work on the biomes.
The bio.
Yeah, so if you followed our Around the World or are trekking the globe here this last year, we used biomes as our kind of science study for that. And Matt's putting together fabulous videos, and I'm working on books, and we will have that done this summer. We are going to have it done actually very soon. So we're working really hard on that. So definitely check out that. Pay attention to the YouTube. And if you're shopping for curriculum, if you don't know where to find good resources, our website, homeschool-together.com, gives you a full list of secular resources by grade and subject with a bit of a synopsis of what it is and our review if we've already reviewed it. So keep checking back there, and everything that you order through the site helps to support the show. So that's just, it's a win-win-win.
Win-win-win-win. We're continuing with our kind of themed effort here around reading comprehension. We talked a lot about reading comprehension last week. It felt like a year ago. Back when we had kids. And so we're going to pick up with that and maybe talk about a new wrinkle, something that we probably are very well aware of, and things that we already kind of do in general. But we're going to talk like a lot of the aspects of asking really good questions and teaching our children how to also ask questions, especially around what they're reading. How do they understand that? How are they evaluating and analyzing that? And ultimately, with the hopes of eventually creating their own content, whether that is writing or answering, in paragraph form questions about that text, being able to take all of their learning and all of their thinking and put that into their own words on whatever topic they're reading on.
Yeah. So in this reading comprehension series, really, this is the first step. It's asking great questions. And it really is because that reading comprehension starts with curiosity. So questions are think of it as like your bridge between reading and thinking. So they've read something, and now we want them to think about that and, make inferences and do interpretation. So we're going to talk inferences and predictions next week. But this is that first step to start thinking about what they read in a bit deeper context. Yeah,
I think it kind of gets you that aspect that we often hear about thinking critically, and how do you think critically? How do you analyze what you're reading? How do you verify what you're reading? Those are a lot of skills that we have to teach our young children how to do that. And I think they can be challenging for them to kind of like bridge that gap and learn that. There's a lot of subtleties in there. Around, analyzing a text. I know that's becoming more of a challenge these days with online content, social media, videos. It's not just reading comprehension, but it's just, critical thinking with respect to, what they watch or what they read, what they see posted online or whatnot. So we need to be able to give our kids a lot of, the utility belt, the Batman utility belt
That's right.
of skills so they can go ahead and operate, in the wild efficiently, I think.
Yeah. So to talk fully about asking good questions, we're going to go over modeling and scaffolding and practicing strong questions across ages. So where this starts is, why do questions even matter? I think is a good question to start with. A question for the questions. So it really makes your passive reading active. So like you could ask, why do you think this character lied? As opposed to saying, what did the character do? Which doesn't require as much thought. So asking a question like why, it's like, okay, this isn't just washing over me. I'm having to actually use my brain to think about, what do I think? Why was that character motivated to do that or say that?
Yeah, right. Or can I extend that into moving beyond the plot and moving towards the meaning?
Right.
And that the character's motivations all factor into that, whether it's a fictional tale that you're reading where we're trying to learn about morals and whatnot. A lot of our reading for our young ones is centered around kind of those type of aspects.
Right. Yeah. How to be in the world.
Yeah. How to be in the world and learn good practice.
How to be a good friend, how to be a good citizen
of
the world.
All of that. Yeah. But even if, our students are starting to engage with a little bit of nonfiction work, especially if you're reading a little bit of history, you're doing some science reading, you have the similar aspects, not just what did we talk about what's happening, but why does that happen? Like
exactly,
you can almost see that as something like, if you're talking about the moon changing its phases, well, we ask the question, well, why is that happening? Not just that, it's now at this phase, it's now at this phase. Mm-hmm. We want to make sure that not just that you know what is going on, but you know why it's going on.
Right.
That kind of that conceptual level.
Exactly. It encourages our kids to be really engaged with the reading. It encourages them to reflect on what they've heard and then to make some emotional connections to what they heard as well. So it's not all just passive, right? And if we can teach our kids, if we can ask good questions, which then they'll internalize and become independent, they'll start asking good questions themselves. Whether they do it, totally consciously or subconsciously, they're going to start thinking through character motivations and deeper meanings in what they read. And they're going to start questioning whether what they read might be true or false or, have bias or whatever these things are as we go on through the years and they read more and more complex material. So asking good questions really does make a huge difference in understanding and thinking about what we read.
Well, when we get that understanding and that thinking, that ultimately will build them the resilience and independence
exactly.
when they are, having to engage in materials, learning things on their own, and even going to the point where they begin to monitor their own thinking. Mm-hmm. That's called metacognition. And so basically understanding how you're thinking and your thinking process and trying to analyze if my thinking process is wrong and if I need to change that. That's not just a simple task. It's actually a fairly complex task. Trying to understand, maybe I should change the way I do things. And maybe that I will get a better outcome out of that. And so all these things are layering on top of each other to begin to have that analytical mind that you're starting to think about what's happening as opposed to just, like, as you said earlier, let it wash over you. Mm-hmm. You want to actually engage with the material. All of these aspects comes into ultimately the independence where, our children go off and we have to let them into the world. Like our daughter is currently at a camp right now. And we hope that all those skills that we've worked on, making sure she's brushing her teeth and doing all these things that
she's being a good friend
and being a good person,
including,
and all that. Yeah.
Kids and not excluding anyone. And, that she's emotionally stable and resilient if something happens. Yeah, there's all kinds of stuff. In the middle of this camp, they do like a camp out at the camp, or they actually normally stay in cabins, but they actually stay like in tents one night and everything. And it's like, wow, it's a lot of like resilience for a 9-year-old to be away from her parents and then be like, and we're going in tents.
And those are life skill independence, totally. But, translated almost parallel is our knowledge and independence and learning and thinking and analyzing and having those similar skills. The things that we want them to do in the real world, we also want them to have these skills of critical thinking and reading comprehension and doing these type of things, even at the youngest level, right?
Right. We're not.
Our youngest is going to camp next week, and 6-year-old going off to camp. It's mommy and daddy are a little concerned.
It's true that the text that they're going to be analyzing and things that they're going to be thinking about is not. We're not talking about some crazy level here. It's just at the very basic level. We read a story where, our youngest loves the Little Critter books, right? Little Critter is trying to help his dad and always goes horribly. And, you're trying to understand at the end why our daughter was asking like, his dad's never mad.
Yeah.
Like, why is his dad never mad, right? Because his dad loves his son and he appreciates his son's trying to help him. And so it can be really basic stuff. Our kids are naturally curious. They naturally ask questions, but they don't naturally always ask good questions for critical thinking. And that's where modeling is really important. So the first thing we wanted to talk about is to pause while you're reading and ask aloud what you're wondering. Mm-hmm. So instead of it always being a question to your kid. So my youngest and I were reading a book the other day, and I stopped and I was like, why do you think he said that?
Yeah. I heard you doing this.
I was like, I wonder what I would do in this situation, and stuff. So it wasn't like, hey, what do you think's going on right now? I was like, I wonder how I would react if that happened. And of course, your child's right there, and she's like, well, I think this would happen, right?
Yeah. Well, and sometimes playing the like kind of the devil's advocate a little bit is kind of surprising. Like to your learner, it's like, oh, I think that was a good thing. That was not a good thing.
Right, exactly. Yeah, you can kind of feign a little bit.
Yeah.
It's true. You can also ask, that was interesting. Do you think that clue we just read about might mean something? As if you're in it with them, right?
I found that this is also helpful if you're doing a lot more challenging texts, if you're trying to pull them up a little bit. Mm-hmm. There's a book we're reading in the Summer of Science right now. I don't know if our next video has come out yet by the time this comes out, but there's a book that we're reading called Where Are the Aliens?, which is a famous question that Enrico Fermi asked amongst some other colleagues. He's a famous physicist, was part of the Manhattan Project. I think he worked in Chicago on nuclear physics. And I have his book. And and
you're such a geek.
I know. He's one of the titans. But anyway, so he asked this famous question, where are the aliens? And he started going through this thought experiment and everything. It's a very difficult book. And so I'm having to pause a lot more and ask questions, not necessarily to my third grader, fourth grader, because I think she kind of understands what's going on.
It's really for her. The 6-year-old is just a tag along on that one.
But I get to ask these questions, and I always ask the little one. I go, well, what do you think about? Would aliens be hiding from other aliens? She goes, I don't know. That sounds reasonable. I think that.
Yeah.
So, you're a dark forest theory person.
Why do you think they'd be hiding? And there's some good questions. So I think you can start definitely with asking questions from your perspective, kind of wondering aloud about things. But then you can start, with your modeling, asking some open-ended questions of your learner that, aren't just recall questions. It's not just what happened. Maybe it's like, what would you have done in that situation? Or why do you think that character did that? Or how would you feel if that happened to you? Right? Just, we don't want to say like, where did they go? What did they do? It's funny. I do ask our 6-year-old that sometimes because I want to know if she's actually listening, because she's like insists on playing while I read. Yep. So sometimes I do ask those just listening checks.
But doing these types of questions, I mean, they're not intuitive. Sometimes we're in there. We got a stack of books. And we got to get through them today.
Right.
And I got to read, and we got chapter books we got to read, and man, I got to read, right? And asking these questions does make it take a little bit longer.
But it's the quality over quantity, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Like I'd rather have more quality discussion and understanding of the text than just blazing through, 10 children's books because we can in 30 minutes. And in some respects, sometimes it's. We don't remember to ask these questions or all the time. And that doesn't mean we're bad parents or bad homeschoolers or anything like that. But we just have to constantly remind ourselves that in the moment when we are reading to our children, yes, sometimes we're reading things for fun. And obviously that's great. And we don't want to always make the things that are fun feel like education, because sometimes we could feel like, oh, you're just keep quizzing me. You keep questioning me. But
there's a balance. Like there's a balance. You don't want to ask a question every sentence, right?
But the books that matter for like our curriculum, if you're doing ancient civilizations and you're reading through a bunch of these chapter books that they have, asking those questions are important. It's part of the experience that you're going for. Mm-hmm. The book that you're reading at night, I don't know, Harry Potter or something like that, whatever you're reading, maybe you don't ask all those types of questions, but when it does matter, or when you are getting into some type of concept or thing that is happening in the books, and it is important, we do need to remember to ask these questions. And I find myself, I always forget, right? Because I feel like I'm rushed. I got all these things I got to do, and it is hard to remember to do these and to ask quality questions, because again, it's requiring me to be creative and me to forward think. And it's like, I'm just here to read the books, you know?
But this is where, you could use AI to give you some even basic prompts where you could, have some a basic list that's not book, specific about things you can be remembering. I tend to think about it like when something happens with the character's emotional arc, right? Something happens, the character is emotional about. They're happy or they're sad or they're frustrated or whatever. That's a great place to probe major plot movements about, and that, you can talk about character motivations. So I think whether you're wondering aloud, modeling that, or you're asking questions, the biggest thing is not to rush the answer, right? Just to give your student time to really think about what they want to input. If the silence needs to stretch a bit, that's okay. Because sometimes there's processing time. Sometimes I think our daughter's not listening, and then she's like, I wouldn't have done that. I would have done this other thing. And she can surprise me sometimes that she was just taking a few minutes to think.
Or the throwaway answer. You get this sometimes is, I don't know. Right. And then you got to come back with a different question or a different angle or a different tone.
Or you might give the answer yourself.
Pull a little bit more out before you can get them to answer it. Yeah.
Right. Like you were talking about giving maybe the wrong answer or, not the typical answer. So when they say, I don't know, you're like, well, I think it was because of this. They're like, no, daddy, no, that's not what it was at all. Or, I wonder why she felt this way. And I said, gosh, do you think it's because of this? And she's like, sometimes you can even give them like little starters, kind of lead them down a path, especially when they're young. I mean, we don't want to give them the answers, but we do want to help get the ball rolling. And I found with our daughter, the first few questions I ask in her reading always go kind of like this. They're, I don't knows, or just keep reading, mommy, or whatever, like they're not great. But the more that they get emotionally invested in the story and we kind of start a dialogue, the easier that this gets. So.
Yeah, I find this as well. Like right now I'm reading Ender's Game as part of our summer science to our oldest, and it's a little bit more elevated than, I don't think it's more elevated than books she's read, but it's a different style of book.
Sure.
Different genre. I know she's read sci-fi in the past, but nothing to this level.
This is for our rising fourth grader.
Yeah, rising fourth grader. And so I think it's a little bit above her level, but asking these questions, these pointed questions, the chapters can be very long as well. And I don't know if she's necessarily used to that. I know the Harry Potter can be a little bit longer, but these are long, long chapters. And sometimes there's some weird things that are happening, like there's some like games that Ender plays and stuff like that. And it almost seems fantasy world. And so if you're not 100% paying attention, all of a sudden you go from like fighting in the game room to like battling giants in a video game. And it can be very kind of like, confusing a little bit. And so sometimes I make sure that she's understanding that, okay, this is what, Ender got out of there and now he's doing this thing and it's a different thing. And, what do you think the game designers are doing here? Because we know that, Graf and those guys are trying to get him to be the best general in the world. Why are they putting these things in front of him, these challenges, and asking more probing questions, especially from not just from Ender's point of view, but understanding that there are characters in the story that are trying to direct this character into, developing and cultivating his ultimate, general persona. And I keep reiterating to her, I go, he is as old as your sister. He is 6 and he is like fighting and playing games that are destroying people and all this type of stuff. And, how would you feel if you were playing and doing those types of things? And how would you feel if these characters were doing this? So you're right. Like it can be giving the space to answer those questions. Yep. I think is sometimes necessary to allow them that time to think, because sometimes they got to really think through these things. And maybe you just give them a little, if there's like a long break, I see sometimes when you do it, you give them a little bit of poke, or you add a little bit more, or maybe try to give them a little bit of a hint at the path, and then they figure it out, right? That type of thing. So sometimes it's not always cut and dry that we just give them the time, but you have to be finesse. We have to finesse our way through this.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a muscle that we're building, right? So initially it's difficult, but once our kids get used to hearing these kinds of questions, then the next step is really to teach them to ask the questions. Yep. So one method that I read about was the stop and wonder. So like pausing while while reading every couple of pages and say, let's each ask a question, so maybe you stop at the end of a scene. What's one question you have about what happened in this, or about what might happen next? So there's always that thing about do you have any questions? Instead, what questions do you have? Just the rephrasing of it. Or what's one question that you have? And letting them ask you a question too helps them to be developing that kind of question asking. Because eventually, you're right, we want them to be independent and internally ask themselves their own questions and be able to kind of put together deeper meanings. So that's one method that we can do. Another is question journals. This would be for older students where they write 1 or 2 questions each after a chapter. So depending on the age of your student, that's an idea. If you have a student who maybe doesn't want to be put on the spot, doesn't want to think of something right then, you could stop at the end of a chapter and say, well, let's each write 1 or 2 questions in our question journals, and then we'll talk about them, right? Or if your child's doing a book club, like our daughter is doing a little book club with her best friend, maybe you use that as something that they could take to that book club and talk about. So that's another idea.
Something they use in the classroom that I've seen in my studies is called Think, Pair, Share, where you ask the students to think about something. And this is very often, there might be in a little pod of desks, like 3 or 4 kids at a time. And what they do is they ask you to think and reflect on something and maybe write something or think of their own questions. And then they share, they pair off with another student and they talk about that thing. And then they turn to the classroom and then they can share what the 2 of them or the 3 of them have come up with. So that's another wrinkle as well, especially if you have some learners that are closer in age, maybe a 3rd and a 4th grader. You had 2 kids that are real close. You can have them do think, pair, share activities as a great way to do that. Something that I've seen in books that we've purchased, and I'm trying to see if there's a general cluster of books that do this, but we picked it up in Prague. We had an American bookstore, and I walked in there, and they had some book sections because a lot of the students in Prague will be learning English as well, and they have pretty much in every one of their bookstores these really great sections where they give they have different classic American literature
or British literature, British
and American literature, and that they're rewritten in different difficulties. And I picked up Call of the Wild, it's one of my favorite books, Jack London there, and in the book it was a shortened version of it. Maybe each chapter was 5 or 6 pages long, and it was there were some pictures in there. But at the end of the chapter, at the end of the book, they had questions and, that and things that she had to answer as well. So they had her doing journal activities. So if you're reading a book, you may be able to get maybe a simpler version of the book, and it comes with these type of reading comprehension questions that you can then stimulate some additional learning and some additional thinking, especially if the student is having to write their own type of stuff. So that's something you can do. And I like the journal activity. That's kind of what we did in Prague, is I had her journaling about what she was reading and asking questions and doing those types of things. I noticed a lot of times in our science workbooks, they do ask her to write questions about, what do you think Johnny would do with these magnets, or what other materials do you think might stick to a refrigerator or something like that? And she hates writing these questions because, and I think a lot of the barrier is sometimes she just doesn't care, and she just doesn't want to answer the question, ask questions and stuff. And so sometimes it can be very difficult where I got to almost pull it out of her a little bit. But I do notice when she is enjoying the material that writing questions is fairly easy for her then, because she's actually interested in it. So the interest level you may gauge, especially with the questioning. If you're starting out with it, maybe start with something that they really like to help develop that skill, so that you can then translate that into maybe some other aspects or areas of your homeschool, history, science, or whatnot, that will also ask you to write questions. They'll be a little bit more comfortable on how to do that.
Yeah. Well, maybe you don't stop in the middle of your reading. Maybe you do finish a whole chapter, and then, maybe you do your own little home book club thing. Get some tea, get a cookie. Hey, let's sit around and talk about it, kind of like adults would talk about a book. So one of the things to remember is that questions at different ages are going to be very different, right? Your youngest kids, you're going to be asking, why did he do that? Why did you think she feels that way? What would you do in that situation? Just kind of really basic ones. How do you think she's feeling right now? A lot of social emotional things, right? Your middle grades, are going to be more about like what might happen next. How does this compare to that other book that you read? Why did the author include this scene in this book? What do you think its purpose was? So, you're getting into a little bit deeper, and then your tweens and teens are going to be more like, what are the motivations of the character?
Yeah, themes and whatnot.
Themes. Is this narrator? Do you think the narrator is reliable? Why do you think the narrator is reliable? Why or why not? Kind of thing.
How's this book related to events in history at that time? That type of stuff.
Right. What do you think the author is trying to make you feel with this? Is the author saying something more than what's on the page, right? So that's a whole different thing, interpreting like high school lit. But just so you can see that the ages definitely differ, and it's going to depend on your child, their understanding level, and the depth. And the more that we train these muscles, then the more advanced questions that we can ask, and the greater the conversations we can have about what we read. Yeah,
and then kind of moving on from there, kind of going, carrying that forward is understanding like the levels of these questions. There are surface level questions, as you kind of showcase there, but there's also these depth questions. We kind of break them up into two areas here, like literal questions and then analytical questions, kind of what you were saying before, where it's, what is the depth of the story, the meanings and things like that, getting into those deeper aspects of what he's writing.
Whereas literal is going to be more like, are they understanding?
Yeah.
Are they understanding what we're writing? So it's not just, we're not kind of going down to that comprehension level, but for like our youngest, I'm asking her a lot of literal questions because I want her to know that she's actually understanding the plot that's happening in the story. And then once I know that she is, then we can ask some slightly deeper level questions about how we think characters are feeling or why they might have said or done something.
And that kind of moves into something that I've seen in my school, this idea of the Bloom's taxonomy, which is, if you just go ahead and search that, and I'll put a link to it down below. It's kind of if you think of it as kind of like a pyramid, and it has various levels. And as you move up from the bottom to the top, you're adding complexity. And at the very, very bottom, we're just trying to understand, basically, what are we talking about? Can we remember what we're doing? And then as you move up, your understanding gets deeper. You begin to apply that information and be able to analyze that information. And ultimately you evaluate it. Once you can do some evaluation, you have all the skills to then create your own answers. So older students will be able to do this Bloom's taxonomy very quickly when they are given a prompt and they need to write an analytical essay, like a 5-paragraph essay. They're going through this whole process very quickly. As a younger students, we are trying to help them move up this complexity. So over time, we will expose them to more and more difficult texts, more and more difficult questions, helping them to move from basically just remembering what they have. So you can remember your kindergartner who reads a short story about a spot running and jumping on a tree or something like that. Just remembering what they just read is a very difficult task. But as our students get older, remembering what they just read is not as hard as beginning to understand it and evaluate it and apply that information to questions, to writing prompts, to answering things, and ultimately, being able to create their own text, whether it's a short story that they got to write or write some analytical essay or answer a paragraph on, what they read. We need to be able to move them up this. So it's called the Bloom's taxonomy. So it's a kind of a technique that people use to kind of understand how the mind progresses as it becomes more capable and more able to analyze the text and do more and more greater things as the students evolve and mature.
And you found a great graphic on this. I think it'd be great to include in the show notes.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and put that in the show notes.
Just so you kind of, I love visuals, so you get to see how it progresses. I love a good pyramid. So, we're talking about asking questions, and this can feel a little bit like an assessment or a test, but we don't have to. We need to remember to keep it loose, keep it playful. So a couple of ideas that I read about that I thought were cool, just as some ideas for y'all. Turning the questions into a game, kind of like an Ask the Author, like pretend you're interviewing the writer. What would you ask the writer?
You could pretend to be the writer.
You could pretend to be the writer. You can get dice with question starters on them. So that's a really easy one. Or even if you don't want to get a special die, you could do pull a pull a word out of a hat kind of thing, right? So to determine which one you're going to ask about, you could do question challenges, like after reading, taking turns trying to ask the most surprising questions of each other. And you might be very surprised at the types of questions you get from your child. But that can be really fun. So remember that it doesn't have to feel like, okay, I'm evaluating your critical thinking with every question that I'm asking. But just on a human level, let's discuss what's happening in the story. And that's kind of the first beginnings of really enjoying reading books together as a family. I can hear when you're reading Ender's Game to our daughter afterwards, you guys are having discussions because you really love that book too. Yep. And so you're like, well, that was so cool. What do you think about that? How would you feel if you were in that situation? I know I would feel this way. You're kind of geeking out on like getting to have this good conversation about it. So it doesn't have to be work. It can be fun. So keep it playful.
Well, and I mean, doing assessments can be subtle in that respect.
Yeah.
I think you're right. Another one that I like to do is alternate endings. So when you get to the final part of a short story or whatever and say, okay, at this point, something different happens. What is that different thing? And then tell me what happens after that. You need all the information leading up to that to be able to then say, what is the most likely choice if Cinderella didn't lose her shoe or this thing happened in a different way. Being able to answer those type of what if questions means you have to have a very good understanding of what's come before.
Or how would you have ended this differently?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Especially, our daughter was recently listening to Inkheart, I want to say, and she's like, oh, this series is rough, right? Because there's just a lot of dramatic things. I'm like, what would you have done differently? She's like, oh, well, I think that I would have done this piece differently. And I think that this would have been great if this happened. And she really understands what's going on. And so that can be kind of fun too. I like the alternate endings or the choose your own adventure. Like,
choose your own adventures are great. Yeah.
So we're going to talk a lot about inference and prediction next week. But for now, just kind of bringing this all together. So we talked about modeling curiosity, inviting our kids to ask questions, the depth of those questions, and kind of some good ideas per age.
Scaffolding that along age and capability is super important. Yeah.
Exactly. And then just keeping it playful. So just try a new method this week. Try it with the next book that you're reading. See how it goes for you. Figure out what works for you and your student. But this is a great way to start building that reading comprehension.
Well, we're so lucky because we have some really great, very rich literature-based curriculums. So we are always constantly given the opportunities to improve and test and change and tweak.
And there's so many amazing books out there. Yeah, I mean, there is no shortage of amazing books. In fact, that's the problem. There's too many books. There's too many great books to read, not enough time. So hopefully this will give you a few ideas to start asking great questions and teaching our kids how to ask good questions as well. Thanks so much for joining us today and making us a part of your homeschool journey. Please engage with us on social media. Join our Homeschool Together podcast group on Facebook and find us at Homeschool Together Podcast on Instagram. We'd love to hear your feedback, questions, and recommendations. Until next time,
happy homeschooling!